Your four favorites are The Wild Bunch, Touch of Evil, 2001: A Space Odyssey, and The Exorcist. This is a challenging one because you've got four classics in four different genres, and you already saw the most obvious choices, so my options were limited. I know you've already seen Sorcerer, which is from the director of The Exorcist and was written by one of the writers of The Wild Bunch, but you didn't have the original film The Wages of Fear marked as watch, and I really think you'd like this one. The opening of The Wild Bunch feels like it was inspired by this movie. It's a 1950s thriller like Touch of Evil. Like 2001, it's a highly influential film that uses prolonged sequences and deliberate pacing to gradually build tension. And it has this atmosphere of psychological dread like The Exorcist. The Deer Hunter is a classic like all of your favorites. It depicts male camaraderie and violence like The Wild Bunch. It's got this feeling of moral ambiguity and suspense like Touch of Evil. It's an epic like 2001 and The Wild Bunch. And the characters endure situations that are dangerous and traumatic like in The Exorcist. Since The Wild Bunch and Touch of Evil are both set in Mexico, another movie that takes place there that's also a Western like The Wild Bunch and a classic like all four of your favorites is The Treasure of the Sierra Madre. Since Touch of Evil is a film noir, a neo-noir I want to recommend is Experiment in Terror, which like Touch of Evil has a Henry Mancini score. And fun fact, the cinematographer of this film worked on Touch of Evil as a camera operator. Since you've got a film noir and a sci-fi film in your favorites, a film that combines elements of both genres that I think you might like is 12 Monkeys. Naturally, I thought of a bunch of Westerns since you're a fan of The Wild Bunch, and you already saw most of them. But one that you didn't have marked as watched is Destry Rides Again, which is one of my personal favorites. I can't guarantee you'll like it as much as I did, but hopefully you do. But just in case, a few other Westerns you didn't have marked as watched that you might like are Stagecoach, McCabe and Mrs. Miller, Bad Day at Black Rock, The Man from Laramie, and Johnny Guitar. Since your favorites are highly influential classics, I feel like I need to recommend some more of those, and the staging of certain scenes in The Wild Bunch seemed inspired by the Great Train Robbery. And while I'm on the topic of trains, another classic I think you'd appreciate is The General. Speaking of trains, since you like Touch of Evil, another 1950s film noir I want to recommend is Strangers on a Train. But a few other films that fall into that 1950s film noir category are The Asphalt Jungle, The Big Heat, Sweet Smell of Success, and my personal favorite, In a Lonely Place. Since you like 2001, this is a much older and much shorter film, but I want to recommend A Trip to the Moon because both films are science fiction films involving space with some really iconic imagery. And another classic sci-fi film that, like 2001, pioneered some aspects of sci-fi filmmaking is Forbidden Planet. A couple movies that lean more into the existential side of science fiction that I think you might like are The Abyss and The Man Who Fell to Earth. I know there aren't any samurai films in your favorites, but I want to recommend Demons because it blends together elements of film noir and horror, and you've got a film noir and a horror film in your favorites. Power of the Wolf, like The Exorcist, is a classic horror film starring Max von Sydow. I don't want to recommend a bunch of movies involving demons and possession since you like The Exorcist because so many of them just feel like pale imitations of The Exorcist, but I also feel like it's too vague to be like, here's a horror film since The Exorcist is a horror film. So I'll recommend a movie that also involves demons and possession that feels like it's doing something entirely different and not just copying The Exorcist, and that's The Wailing.